So everyone should have gotten that little box. Awesome. So I'll do a quick set of announcements first, and then I'll introduce our panelists, and then we'll start. And then with any remaining time, we can take some audience questions as well. So feel free to use the chat to speak with other audience members, but I will not ask any questions from the chat until the Q&A section. And some announcements. This panel is hosted by the Philly chapter of Democratic Socialists of America, Philly DSA for short. DSA is the largest socialist organization in the country, and we believe that working people should run both the economy and society democratically to meet human needs, not to make profits for a few. If you're interested in DSA, I'll be putting some links in the chat. I think Duncan might be helping me out with that as well. The DSA website, as well as the Philly DSA website, will also be in the chat. We have a ton of meetings and events coming up that you can find at phillydsa.org/events. And all of those links are going to go in the chat momentarily. And I want to plug 3 of those events in particular. So Philly DSA is part of the Rent Control Coalition, which is fighting for rent control in Philadelphia. And this summer is canvassing to build support for expanded good cause legislation. Philly DSA hosted the first of these canvasses. They're happening throughout July and August. We hosted the first one last Saturday. It was incredibly successful. It was super fun despite the heat. And we are hosting another one this Saturday in West Oak Lane. And I really hope you can join us. And I'm going to drop a sign up link in the chat as well, right here. I also want to plug the Green New Deal Commission and the Housing Committee. These are the 2 bodies within Philly DSA that worked together with Michelle from the Rent Control Coalition to think through and put on this panel. So I'd love to invite you all to the next Housing Committee meeting on Thursday, July 29th from 8 to 10 p.m. That link will be in the chat shortly as well. And the next Green New Deal Commission meeting on Tuesday, August 2nd from 6:30 to 8 p.m. And that link will be in the chat as well. And both committees have a lot of really exciting campaigns going on, so I encourage you to check them out. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists and begin asking them some questions. Daniel Aldana Cohen is a Green New Deal scholar. Jeremy Avellino is a sustainable architect here in Philly. Michelle Crouch is a tenant organizer and member of the Philadelphia Rent Control Coalition. And Miss Esther is a tenant leader in her own building. So I'll go without any further ado, I will go ahead and ask some questions of our panelists. So the first is going to be for Daniel. So I'll let you kick it off with kind of an intro. What is a Green New Deal for housing? Why is it necessary?
Thank you, Sean, for the question. So happy to be with everybody. Very honored and happy to have Green New Deal Scholar as my affiliation. I think I would like that only for the future. So what is a Green New Deal for housing? I mean, I think the basic idea of saying a Green New Deal for housing is connecting the crises of housing and the crises of the climate emergency. We need, obviously, to do something about housing. About 40 million households in this country pay over 1/3 of their income in rent or mortgages. About half of that, 20 million households, pay over 50% of their income in rent or mortgage payments. That was before the COVID crisis. Tens of millions of households have faced eviction since the COVID crisis. So we have a massive, massive crisis of housing affordability. There isn't a single county in the country where a full-time minimum wage worker can afford the average price of a 2-bedroom apartment. So massive housing crisis, was horrifying existential crisis. Arguably eviction, along with the climate emergency, is one of the great existential crises that people face, along with police violence. At the same time, we have a climate emergency. No one's going to be staying in their homes if we have massive amounts of climate change. And even with moderate levels of climate change, probably tens of millions of households just in this country are going to end up moving. We have extremely unaffordable energy in homes. In the Philly region, half of Black families cannot afford their utility bills. Again, and that was before COVID. So the idea of a Green New Deal for housing simply says, look, housing is a human right. And what it means for housing to be a human right in a warming world is that every single person should have access to housing that they can afford, comfortably afford, that is green, that is healthy, that causes no carbon pollution, that has modern, efficient appliances, that has access to transit, to parks, and so on. And it also means that people are not going to be evicted as a result of green investments in their communities. So to me, something like rent control is an essential environmental policy, because if you don't have rent control, then what that means is that if there's a community on the edge of gentrification and it gets new parks, new transit, new investments, then the lowest income tenants, often the tenants of color, are going to end up getting evicted from those places. That's not environmental justice whatsoever. On the contrary. So sort of step back again, what it would look like to live in a world where there was a Green New Deal for housing in a few years from now. It would mean that any person would know that they were free from the fear of eviction, that their housing was safe from extreme weather, that their housing contributed absolutely nothing to climate change, and that they would have a long-term stability in a community that would benefit from green investment overall. So I think it's a transformative vision. It's a vision that runs against every tendency in capitalism, and it is a vision of stable, safe, healthy green communities that are compatible with a stable climate for the rest of time. So I hope that that's an exciting vision for folks, and I know it's broad and it's abstract, and looking forward to putting some flesh on the bones of that description as we continue the conversation tonight.
Thanks so much, Daniel. What a great way to kick it off. Next question is for Jeremy. What does sustainable housing look like in Philadelphia right now? How does your work fit into that current landscape?
Yeah, thanks for having me, by the way. Really nice to be here. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So I think it depends on what the word sustainable means, and I won't dive too much into that, but I think it's a really nebulous term that is kind of like wellness. It can mean like almost anything, and a lot of times mean nothing at all. So I'll leave that alone for now, but I want to start with the big picture, and I think that the introduction was spot on that first and foremost, we need to treat the climate crisis like the emergency that it actually is. And I think a lot of folks don't realize this, but that the built environment plays a huge role in warming the planet. There's an organization called Architecture 2030 that has been tracking this stuff for years, and that has said that the built environment across the entire globe accounts for almost 40% of greenhouse gas emissions, which is a huge chunk. And it's a complicated metric because it's taking into account all of the resources it takes to, mine all of the materials and then build the thing and then deconstruct the thing and then move all the trucks around to like build it, things like that. So it's a huge number when you really think about the built environment and maintenance and things like that. But when you zoom into Philadelphia, Greenworks Philadelphia's climate action playbook actually puts that at like 72%. Because there's just a lot more buildings in Philadelphia. Yeah, right. So I think it's important to not ignore these facts when we're addressing climate change. And, both for new buildings and for retrofits in Philadelphia, the retrofit. And I think if we do ignore that stuff, we do it at our peril. But the opposite of that is a humongous opportunity to really address this Philadelphia setup really well for them. I love Philly. I was born and raised here. I think it's a really unique city. It's an amazing place, but it has this huge challenge of deep poverty that I know that the crew is really familiar with. But I think we have this wonderful asset here that, is the row home. Something like 400,000 row homes are in Philadelphia, largest concentration of attached single family home in the entire country. Really a beautiful thing. And so we often see that as naturally occurring affordable housing, right? A couple of factoids from the Healthy Row House Initiative is that 70% of all housing units in the city are row houses. 75% are over 50 years old. 78% of Philadelphia seniors over age 60 own their own homes, right? So that's a huge asset. Problem is, there's often a challenge to keep them updated. They can often, through maintenance deferrals, can actually make people sick. So it's a huge problem in the city. 38% of owner-occupied homes in 2012 were owned by households earning less than 35%. Now that's like a 10-year-old fact right there, right? And that was pre-COVID, pre the last 4 years. So 40% of asthma episodes are due to asthma triggers in the home. So this is like a huge deal. So homes have like this huge opportunity, but can also be a huge burden. So when we're brought on to retrofit homes, we often do it past the house standard. And not to get into too many technicalities, but you can think of that as putting on an extra jacket around the home, like wintertime jacket around yourself. And you want to make the building extra insulated, extra airtight, and then provide continuous mechanical ventilation, which is like healthy, refreshed, enthalpy recovered air 24/7. So think of it as the healthiest home you can imagine, a low carbon home because you're retrofitting something that's already there, right? So like all of the resources that were used to make something are being kept, and it's being built in a way so it can last decades long. When you take it, you're not taking it off grid, but essentially you're taking it into a low carbon future, right? So you're decarbonizing this thing, and by bringing it into, it's already a low carbon building because it exists, but you want to make it a zero energy building so it's not using any more resources to heat and cool it and turn on the lights and things like that. And inevitably for us, this is, and for our clients, this is about resilience, right? Because we're entering into an age of like an unknown climate, present and future, right? I mean, we don't experience a lot of rolling blackouts in the city, but look what just happened in Texas, look what's happening in California. And we can see that the idea of a home as a resilient node being able to essentially be both a thermal battery and a power battery to skate easily through power outages, through unknown power future, is something that Philadelphia, I think, would really benefit from, socially, especially in low-income neighborhoods. And so, you know, we build this we do this for new construction as well, new row houses, new apartment buildings, but I'm really passionate about retrofit. It's really important. It's much harder work. It's real complicated work. It's real fussy work, but we think it's really good for and for the planet.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jeremy. There's a question later on about retrofits. And we are losing you a little bit towards the end of what you say with your sound.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got me now? Okay. Sorry about that.
All good. Next question is for Michelle. So describe your work as a tenant and housing organizer. How do you see a Green New Deal for housing fitting into that?
Yeah, so thanks for having me. If I start cutting out with the internet, just tell me in the chat and I'll like mute my video or something. But yeah, so I've been kind of actively organizing for about 2 years now. There's 3 main buildings that I've been working in over that time. You know, I sit here in my row house that is 50 plus years old, but mostly have been organizing in larger buildings. And 2 of them are senior buildings, so residents 55 plus, so not seniors, but 55 plus. All 3 have people who are on a mix of subsidy programs, some people full pay, some people receiving vouchers, different things. People have different levels of mobility, especially in the senior buildings. And what I hear from people when I talk to them in all of these scenarios is concerns about repairs and maintenance that especially are related to health issues. So mold, water coming in and causing mold, old materials, asbestos, pests. Brit Shalom House, one of these buildings that I have been working in for probably the longest. It was built in 1968. I'm sure it was very beautiful in 1968, but now it has like raccoons living in the ceiling and like dropping down on people. And so these buildings, they have to be either massively retrofitted or torn down in most cases. Like they're nearing like not being livable. Fire suppression systems that are out of date, like huge health and safety concerns. And so since we're reaching a point in a lot of our housing in Philadelphia where it's going to need some kind of overhaul anyway. And so this is our opportunity to put these, you know, these Green New Deal, these practices in. And, you know, as Dan mentioned, utility prices is a huge one. How will our housing be designed for the climate effects that we are experiencing? Again, I was at the Brit Shalom House recently and talking to an older woman, and she asked me about, you know, does the landlord, don't they have to provide air conditioning if it gets over a certain temperature? And the answer is they don't. If it's specific in your lease that air conditioning is offered in the lease, then the landlord has to provide it. But if it's not in the lease, there's no like particular specification about that. And as you know, we've seen incredibly high temperatures. This is a very large apartment building. It's like, I forget how many floors, but it's like 300 some units. So think how hot it's getting on those top floors, and how can we, you know, make our housing livable for the conditions that we're going to be facing, especially for vulnerable people, seniors, people with mobility issues, and things of that nature.
Thanks so much, Michelle. The next question is for Miss Esther. Thank you so much for joining us. How did you get involved in tenant organizing?
I was working with Temple students, and they needed help in the community with this building because it's really a terrible building. It's not kept up at all.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to the meetings and volunteered to help clean up the environment.
And what was that early experience like?
It was hard in the beginning because a lot of people didn't believe that it was cleanable and sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
But now they're working, well, they were working on it.
Mm-hmm. And how have you gotten involved more recently in your building?
Just talking to the neighbors. We made floor cabins. There's 2 of us, and we worked together, knocking on door to door to get them to come out.
And what's that experience been like?
It was interesting because a lot of neighbors I didn't know I had.
Mm-hmm. And so it's been really nice to get to know your neighbors and talk to them about what the building is like and what everyone's experience is.
Yes.
Awesome.
I think it brought the building closer together.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome, Esther. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The next question, I'll go back to Daniel. So what can we expect to see nationally in terms of a Green New Deal for housing? Can you discuss Green New Deal for housing legislation as it currently stands? And how should funding for green projects be obtained?
Thank you. That's a great question. Let me first just pick up on something that came up from the other panelists. I mean, I think something to emphasize is that the Green New Deal piece is not like this crazy luxury that we want to put on top of standard housing justice. It's like in the 1930s or 1920s, if there's too much traffic congestion in a city, you wouldn't add an additional lane for horse-drawn carriages. And if in the 1990s, the homes were too cold, you wouldn't put a coal oven right in the middle of the living room to heat them up. So in the 2020s, if you want to provide any kind of upgrade whatsoever to housing, you're going to want to use the most modern all-electric appliances. You want to use a technology called heat pumps, which is basically a reversible air conditioner that's going to provide cooling and heating at the same time. As Jeremy was saying, you're going to ensure all-around constant ventilation. You can have more insulated homes so that you don't get ventilation through the walls. And then you're going to have perpetual circulation of air. What's good for COVID in buildings and in homes, what's good for asthma is what's good for climate. It's a well-sealed home with modern all-electric appliances, clean, green, top technology. Every single person deserves that. People who are poor or who are racialized don't deserve 30-year-old obsolete technology in their homes. So nationally, what is a Green New Deal? What does it look like to build that, from the national point of view? And that's important because no level of government, no private entity has the resources of the federal government. So one, we need to build new housing, new non-market housing. The Homes Guarantee campaign that I'm a part of advocates for 12 million units of new social housing, non-market housing in 10 years. Representative Ilhan Omar from Minneapolis, Minnesota has proposed a bill to do just that. We need to save the public housing that we have now. I led the research for a bill that AOC and Bernie Sanders introduced, Green New Deal for Public Housing Act, that would do a green upgrade for every single one of the million public housing units in the country. That's really important. And that vision is kind of up for grabs in this federal infrastructure funding, could well get funded. I think federally, we have to look beyond just those bills. How other ways of getting new housing built? There's going to be a proposal coming soon for a social housing development authority, which is a really exciting idea that's been played out. And the idea basically is that a public agency, when homes are foreclosed, that public would buy them up and then put those buildings into non-market green housing rather than letting commercial real estate companies buy up those foreclosed homes and just generate more corporate housing for profit. We definitely need to expand a program called LIHEAP, which helps low-income folks pay the bills. We can't say to a Black family in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, oh, you can't afford your bills, but don't worry, in 8 years, we're going to retrofit your home. What about the next 8 years in between? We should be making sure that nobody has to sacrifice on essentials to cover their bills. Nobody's getting shut off notices. Nobody's keeping their home at an unsafe temperature. Again, half of Black families are in that situation today. I don't think it would be good, and we should continue to fight for something like rent control nationally, but we're going to have to do some of that locally. And this brings me to another point. there's going to be a lot of money coming out of the federal government. We're not going to get everything that we want on the left, certainly not that we want as socialists. There will be money coming from the federal government through infrastructure plans, even the American Recovery Plan that's already passed. How do we spend that money locally? So we have people like Senator Nikhil Saval, who's already out there. He's the lead Democrat in the Housing Committee. Love that poster there, Sean. Nikhil Saval, lead Democrat on the Housing Committee, who's out there right now in the Senate saying, listen, here's legislation. We're going to propose a comprehensive vision of green, healthy retrofits to spend $150 million in American Recovery Plan dollars in Philadelphia. And Nikhil, who campaigned on a Green New Deal for housing, has other big ideas. Like in Philadelphia, for instance, we estimate about 25,000 vacant or abandoned homes. Those could be converted into green community land trusts. And that's actually already happening in Baltimore. They can do it in Baltimore, just down the I-95. We can certainly do it in Philly. And indeed, someone called Michelle Wu, who's running for mayor in Boston, is also running on a green community land trust vision. So I think, there's a lot of exciting legislation federally, but in the nitty gritty, I think in the next 6 to 18 months in Philly, a big fight will be grab hold of those federal dollars. They're going to come through all kinds of crazy, complicated programs and put them to work in the best possible way for the families that need it here in Philly.
Yeah, right.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Next question is for Jeremy. What sorts of green projects would you like to see in Philadelphia? You kind of already nodded to it in the last question. But yeah, curious how you envision those green spaces in Philly and how are we going to get the funding for them?
Yeah, I think I might have just answered all the questions in the first one. So let's see if I can expand upon that. But I would like to, in general, I there's a term affordable housing that gets floated around, and I think that I prefer like housing as a human right. But even just to use that term, I think it, at the end of the day, it needs to be imagined by people and for people within their specific context, within their community, as that community imagines it and needs it. Often affordable housing is institutionalized and it's applied on to people and at community. And even if it's well-meaning, it can be, it can have effects that are permanent. It often doesn't allow folks to even build up wealth, like other folks who own homes, right? And so it doesn't often end homeowners. So I think a lot of the existing affordable housing legislation needs to be tweaked more towards wealth redistribution and generational wealth. I just always thought at a very simple level that this country has all the money to solve housing. We have a housing crisis, but we have no shortage of money. So I think it's more about what happens when it comes to policy, I believe. I think that we need to, I think we need to tax wealth more and income less. And I think you see something happen there. Like I think about, imagine the money, like you're watching billionaires flying onto the edge of space. You got Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, you got Richard Branson getting out of space. But there's more money in those programs than it would deep energy retrofits in the country, at least Philadelphia, right? So plenty of money. I think it's like, what are the priorities of our society? I think we need to. In terms of funding at home, I do think the construction tax start. And now I just have clients that say, yeah, it's a cost of doing business. It didn't stop for-profit development like everyone was so afraid it was, right? And I think there's other policies we can do to shift taxation on wealthy and we need to, the 10-year tax abatement is thankfully ending this year after being put off. And I'll be really happy when that's done personally. I don't think it's helpful for Philadelphia, arguably, a few reasons, but I think it's I think we need to look more towards creative ways to redistribute wealth within the economy to make housing right for all. And in terms of green spaces, I'm a big fan of greening streets, like having just knocking out 10% of the streets in Philadelphia, no cars, and making them these the Netherlands Lunar, where it's like a green walk street where cars can sometimes come in and out to like unload things, but for most street. So I think imagining deconstructing the asphalt and concrete and bring it back to nature. I think we can't imagine that full, like, because I don't even think we can imagine how much cars have taken in terms of just physical garbage and safe. But I can imagine a lot of buckets don't need. That's one space. One space.
Yes. Sorry, Jeremy. You're breaking out like towards the end of what you say in each sentence. So
The end of what I'm saying is not important, so it's just, it's probably just fine.
Okay. Yeah, maybe for the next question, just like turn off your camera or something if it's an internet issue. And then we'll bring the next question to Michelle. So can you speak to the local politics, political actors that are important in achieving green social housing as you see it? And how can legislation be advanced at the green social?
You're reading it too.
Yeah, I love hearing these like big, giant picture vision ideas, and then I'm a very like small picture person. I'm like, how do we get it through council? How do we get the votes? You have to get your bill out of committee. You have to get the majority of the committee votes. Then it goes to the full council, has to get majority in the full council, has to go to the mayor. The mayor can veto it. If the mayor vetoes it, it goes back to council. You have to get 2/3. And so you really have to understand how council works. I'm not saying I have a perfect understanding, but it's almost like a hobby of mine at this point, like watching the soap opera that is Philly local politics and researching its history. But you have to understand who is influential. Philly Power Research is a group that does a lot of great work around like who's donating to who, like that whole recent parking garage bill thing they tried to do, looking at who's donating to who, understanding like who kind of votes in blocks. Like there's certain council members that tend to vote together. There's certain council members who tend to vote against each other. It's interesting because, we have Kendra Brooks from the Working Families Party and David O, who's a Republican, but the rest of them are all Democrats, but that doesn't mean they're all on the same page about things. I was kind of thinking of it, it's like you're playing chess, but like your chess pieces like have weird personal like grudges against each other. Or I shouldn't say personal grudges, but there's just a lot of politics at play. So understanding that and understanding who the influences are on these individuals. One thing I think a lot about is how powerful the building trades are in Philadelphia and the building trade unions. And you would think that there should be a way to, if the Green New Deal for housing is going to involve creating a lot of jobs for retrofitting and building and doing these like construction projects, that there should be some way to hopefully have those forces like be supportive. So I think it's just something you have to keep a really close eye on in terms of just like the mechanics of getting something passed on a city level. We also have in Philadelphia, I think they're trying to do away with this, but I don't think they've gotten it done yet. There's a policy called resign to run. So if you're a city council person and you want to run for mayor, you have to resign to do that. The mayoral races, the primary will be in 2023. So, if we have someone who's not good on housing resigning to run, that could be great. If we have someone who's a really strong ally who resigns to run, that could also just change the calculus. So it's really about understanding how power works on this hyper local level, I think.
And thanks so much, Michelle, for that inside look. Ms. Esther, next question's for you. How do you speak to your neighbors and others that you've organized with about the kind of larger systems that impact their daily lives and how folks experience that?
Well, I think everybody here is so disappointed in what's going on in this building. It doesn't take much to get a conversation started on how we improve it.
Mm-hmm.
And first of all, they need to do better placement. People they're bringing in, like go into depth there, what backgrounds they're having, and that would be important too.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like most of the neighbors that most of the people you speak to in your building are generally in agreement on kind of the day-to-day.
Say that again.
Yeah, it seems like most of the people that you speak to in your building are kind of experiencing the same things. Is that correct?
Yes.
And how do people find that they're surprised that folks share the same experience?
Not really, because it's evident when you walk in the door.
Mm-hmm. What does a conversation look like when you knock on a neighbor's door and ask them to sign a petition or something?
Well, most of them want to participate. A lot of them are frustrated with trying to do things and nothing gets done.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to get past the anger first, then you have a conversation. But most of them are very angry about what's going on, especially the trash situation.
Mm-hmm. How do you kind of use that anger to ask people to do something?
Each person is different. You have to kind of be where they're at.
Mm-hmm.
I know when we knock on doors, like, oh, what's now? You know, that kind of thing. You have to explain to them we're trying to make things better.
Mm-hmm.
And
Does
keep
it
that topic.
tend to take a couple of conversations to get someone to do something?
Yes.
Great.
You have to be totally committed to go back. Even to get a form filled out, they'll drop it to me at my door. They won't fill it out then. So what we did a couple weeks ago, we had a cookout, and everybody came out at one time. So the papers and things we needed filled out, they filled out at the picnic, and we accomplished what we needed to have to turn into the city for complaints. So
Yeah.
that's the kind of environment you have to have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the environment of really bringing people together, kind of socially, to talk about the issues that everyone's facing and ask people to do something to take that power back. That's awesome. Thank you. We'll go on to the next round of questions, and this one will go back to Daniel. You've tweeted about the term green neoliberalism. What is that, and how does a Green New Deal for housing interact with that paradigm?
Thank you. So great to get a question that starts with a tweet. One could go on and on and on about green neoliberalism. I think a few important things stand out. First of all, a key idea in green neoliberalism, and we see it now, is that the public sector is never going to be an efficient driver of change. And so it has to be the private sector and companies who deliver the change. The consequence of that is that environmental policy fundamentally turns into investments from the public and the private sector working together that mainly benefit white people, upper middle class people, and wealthy people. That's what green neoliberalism ultimately produces. It produces things like green gentrification. It produces things like greenwashing. It produces maybe organic food for wealthy consumers. But fundamentally, it is delivering a version of green life for almost entirely people who are pretty well off, pretty affluent, and disproportionately white.
Camera.
And that is very bad. I think one other comment, and this picks up maybe on something Michelle was saying, the method of green neoliberalism, or the method of neoliberalism in general, is ruled by elites and experts and companies. Green neoliberalism thrives in a world where most people aren't engaged in politics or can't make their voices heard. And I think Michelle raises a really good point that if we want to deliver on this big vision, which disrupts and totally destroys the status quo, we're going to need, of course, the political savvy, how to win in the committees and so on, but we'll need many more people mobilized and organizing for politics. That's why I think the DSA is so powerful and so important, because the idea of democratic socialism and other left formations and groups like Reclaim Philly, in addition to Philly DSA, are out there saying, if we don't get more working class people, more people of color, more poor people heavily involved in politics, then everything is going to end up getting done as it always was, behind closed doors. It's going to screw the majority and benefit a white minority. So I think we can think about green neoliberalism and do the economic analysis. We also have to think about the political analysis. And that means that we on the left have our work cut out for us in organizing large numbers of people to do disruptive mobilization, because that's the only thing that's going to successfully change the way that economics is going right now. And it's the only thing that's going to change the way that environmental politics are going right now.
Thank you so much. The next question is for Jeremy. So I think a nested concept within green neoliberalism is what I think some call green gentrification, where sustainable building is concentrated in private projects, drives up prices, ultimately causes displacement. Is that a dynamic that you're witnessing in Philadelphia in the work that you do? And what's your perspective on how to avoid green gentrification?
Well, it is a dynamic I witness because, you know, I do it. I mean, I'm an architect. There's like 2% of the population can even afford my services, right? So you know, I'm already out of reach of most folks, and it's radical that I even became an architect, but that's a different personal story I'll leave for another time. But it's complicated. I mean, the problem is that architects are trained to find creative solutions amidst competing and intersecting forces, and yet we're often brought into the process by developers and by clients way late into the game to design something that is for the community in an often paternalistic way. And you don't learn this until much later in life, and at that point you've kind of done a bunch of damage. And so if you're my age, you're trying to sort of like make up for some of that and learn to listen more and learn to use your skills. Something that Daniel said, you know, not as less of an expert. I mean, you want to bring your skills and offer them up, but not in a way that isn't taking into account listening to the community first and foremost, right? And so that takes a proactive effort to do that, because you're not going to be brought in by someone else to do it, and the market is just set up to do that. And so you know, I think when we do that, we can have a lot of success with communities around how they can imagine and envision how they want their neighborhoods to be. But beyond that, that's sort of design thinking, and we're trained in that. But beyond that, we really need better policies, and we need to demand this, right? Again, we can't just focus. Like, housing has just been an experiment in wealth escalation for individuals and corporations for decades now, right? And we keep thinking that escalator is going to go up and up and up and up and up, but you know, more and more people are left behind. And I think we need to stop seeing housing as wealth acquisition and start seeing it as a basic human right. I know we keep saying that, but we need to really think about that and let that sink in within the architecture community and within the development community, right? I'd be into like things like permanent tax abatements for folks who do an energy-based retrofit on their home, just never pay taxes again, you know, something like that. Like, you really should, because we need the government to understand that basically retrofitting all homes to a zero carbon level is something that we have to do for the survival on this planet because of the carbon footprint of architecture, right? So, you know, connecting these dots and helping the powers that be understand that we don't have any choice but to do this, whether you're incentivizing people to do it or you're, you know, just essentially paying people to do it, it's something that absolutely needs to happen. But in the meantime, I agree, it's essentially green gentrification is the status quo right now.
Yeah, thank you for that very honest and candid answer. Next question for Michelle. How can the struggle for rent control prevent green gentrification? And how can that struggle for rent control be linked to a Green New Deal for housing?
Yeah, I think the connection between gentrification and displacement and rent control is like pretty direct. Most people, I'm sure, understand it. You know, it's like, if you want to get people out of poverty, you give them money, right? Like, that's the most efficient way to do that. If you want to prevent people from being displaced, you stop their rent from going up. And I think we have to, kind of think about having these pieces, any kind of legislation or programming, be tied together so that we aren't getting, you know, without having some kind of protections for tenants, then the norm, this status quo of this neighborhood near great public transit is now more quote unquote desirable, therefore the rents are going to go up. You know, that's what happens right now. Another thing I've been thinking about in terms of rent control and building new housing in particular is when we see resistance to new building, resistance to new construction, which is, you know, in the news in Philadelphia, you know, a lot of times what people are voicing, especially renters nearby are voicing, is the fear, the well-founded fear that this is going to make my rent go up. And I think sometimes people who are super pro housing and are like, oh, but if there's more housing supply, rent prices will go down, kind of miss the fact that that might work on a metro level or on a larger level, but I don't think that works on a block level. Like, you know, on 52nd Street, the Apple, it used to be the Apple storage apartments, and now it's the Irving. It's like this luxury housing development. I mean, it's a beautifully retrofit building. They were giving hard hat tours and you got a free beer, so I went on a tour. But they're very expensive. And I think if you walk up and down 52nd Street and say, oh, did this increase in the housing stock decrease your rent? I'm pretty sure that answer is going to be no. So I think if we want to have communities respond more positively to some of these big projects, you have to make sure that people aren't going to get these like unplanned negative side effects, or well, unplanned according to who, but that you aren't going to have these rent increases that then push people out.
Sorry, everyone. I think my internet just cut out for a second. Am I back?
You're back, yeah.
Okay, great.
Michelle just finished. It's perfect timing.
Okay, awesome. So sorry that the internet is just not working for anyone today. I think we may have lost Miss Esther. I think she may have dropped off unless she's under another name. So in that case, I'll move on to the next question for Daniel. Could you describe, and we've touched on it a couple of times in this conversation, but could you describe green retrofitting and how important it is for Green New Deal and housing, especially in Philadelphia, and how you see that kind of maybe Philadelphia as a model for other cities, or what the kind of larger story is there?
Thanks. That's a really good question. So, you know, we need to build a ton of beautiful green new housing, but of course, most housing has already been built. You know, the government, or sorry, the economy builds a little over 1 million homes a year. That's, you know, less than 1% of the housing stock. So we have to retrofit housing. What does that look like? You know, the main things are, one, the repairs that a home already needs must get taken care of, obviously, right? So a Green New Deal for housing that just straps a zero carbon energy system onto a collapsing house is no good. So we have to make the repairs that homes already need. When we're putting in new HVAC systems, and Jeremy might get a little bit more into this, you know, we want all electric systems. We use a technology called heat pumps. They can operate in different kinds of ways. You could have a heat pump that you don't see that's plugged into a central air system. You might also have what are called like wells, these kind of rectangles up on your wall. And there's a little line of refrigerants that goes to a condenser, maybe in the backyard, or just kind of attached to the back of the building. So one could kind of get in those details, but essentially what you're looking at is a kind of reversible air conditioning type system where you have condensers outside, and a single set of units are both providing heat and providing cold air. You're going to probably have like an additional ventilation system. You would also replace the appliances. So like every single person in the country should have like Energy Star level super efficient appliances, should have what are called electric induction stoves. Stoves that use gas actually put a lot of toxic fumes into the air. The phrase cooking with gas was actually invented by the gas industry in the 1930s as propaganda. And just as a note, you know, induction stoves, modern induction stoves are not like old-fashioned electric stoves. They work a lot better. A couple things to note for Philly. Notoriously, a lot of homes in Philly right now couldn't even handle the load of this kind of electrification. So a green retrofit program would also have to cover basic electrical work in the homes of Philadelphians so that they actually can stand to increased electrical load of induction stoves and of heat pumps. And I think another important thing is roof repair. It's really important to repair the roofs of low-income homes, especially houses, row houses, so that we could then, if it makes sense for the resident, put solar panels on the roof. Roof repair is expensive. And you have programs right now like Solar Philly, programs where you can get a subsidized solar roof put on your home, But if your roof is not in good enough shape to get that solar panel on your home, then you're not going to even get to take advantage of it. That's one of many reasons that virtually all the solar panels on roofs in America are on the homes of white people, because they have the financial means to have a home in better shape. Also because they have better credit scores, which is another legacy of racism. So all this to say, if we're going to get this done, what I just described, big, expensive changes to low-income homes all across the city, then that's not going to happen through adding additional debt onto low-income residents, right? It's not going to happen by asking tenants to ask their landlords nicely, but it's going to require major public investment. And probably a lot of that is going to be about fighting very hard in Philly to get our fair share of federal investment. And I would just say, if you're in the DSA and you're looking at the congressmen of Philadelphia, people like Brendan Boyle and Dwight Evans, I'm not sure they are the world's best advocates for low-income residents in Philly. And maybe it's time to ask ourselves, does Philly have the kind of representation that progressive places in this country can now get? People like AOC and Jamal Bowman, could we have members of the squad in Philadelphia who will fight tooth and nail to make sure the green investment dollars go into communities in Philly and go in a way that doesn't displace folks out of communities, but actually stabilizes Black and brown and working class communities? That's going to be a very big fight. It's going to take public dollars to do this, and the DSA could play a huge role, I think, in making that happen.
Yeah, thanks so much, Daniel. And so I'm going to skip order a little bit and go to Michelle on the next one. How do you see retrofitting, maybe in conjunction with rent control and the fights that you're in, combating gentrification that is happening so rapidly in the city?
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, I'm turning off my video just because my internet's being a little spotty, but I mean, again, the simplest way to prevent gentrification is to keep people in their homes. And hopefully, this is the type of retrofitting that can be done without someone having to move, that they could stay in their home while it happens. And also that there's funding for it to happen, because needing to pay for home repairs is a huge expense for people. As I think Dan mentioned earlier, or Jeremy, that we have a really large proportion of homeowners in Philadelphia, and a lot of these are older folks. A lot of people have even inherited their homes, so there might not be money set. There might not be a lot of money for repairs. I mean, there's a ton of green retrofits I would love to do to my house, but I can't afford them. So I think having that funded from somewhere that's not coming out of a resident's pocket, and that is not coming out of the landlord's pocket, because the landlord is immediately going to pass that along to tenants. So that funding and those retrofits that's something where I do think there has to be programs for that to not just come out of private pockets.
Awesome. Thanks, Michelle. 100% with you on that one. And Jeremy, I'll give you the next question. And I think I'm going to rephrase it because I think you kind of answered the one that I was going to ask a few times. But I guess I'm wondering, as an architect, so in the current Philadelphia housing stock we've talked about a couple of times, what would your kind of highest priority be? Let's say if you had a big kind of cash infusion and all of the architects and designers that what's kind of the first big project that you would want to tackle in Philadelphia's current?
That's a great question. I think, and first of all, I think, Daniel, if you're not an architect, you should be. I think you really know this stuff really well. So I think the first thing I would do, we like to call it a fabric first approach. If it's winter time and you walk outside with a t-shirt, you think about putting on a jacket. And fabric mean like the building fabric or the building envelope, right? And so I would like to retrofit all of Philadelphia's row homes from the outside, so we don't have to displace people. And I'll say what that means is we can add insulation to the roof on the outside. Daniel's right on everything he said, that we need to make sure that we're taking care of like bulk water concerns or any structural issues or mold issues, stuff like that. But really, adding insulation and new roofing on the outside, adding insulation and new siding on the backs of houses, which are often fairly, in the worst shape, because that's the last place to get maintenance. So in like the little side alleys and the rears, the rear facades, things like that. Adding all new triple pane windows, high performance windows, And then on the front, because, you know, if I added, if I covered over Philadelphia's red brick with siding or something, or stucco, I think they put me in jail, and they probably should. So I'm not going to do that. I would insulate the inside of that wall and keep Philadelphia, you know, Philadelphia's cultural heritage alive as a brick city, and you know, deal with a little bit of thermal bridging there. That would be the first thing I would do. And then the second thing I would do is exactly what Daniel said too, is heat pump everything. You know, what we need to do is first and foremost in this country, develop a resilient electrical grid that can, you know, the entire grid needs to be redesigned. But we need to think of individual houses as part of a resilient node within a village, right? So that if that grid fails, they can handle themselves. So they need to be low load houses to use as little energy as possible, so that very small row house roof, which can usually only hold maximum about a 5 kilowatt solar array, can provide more energy than it needs, right? And so you heat pump everything, electrify everything Daniel just said brilliantly. Then I'd add solar panels on top of that roof, and then I would add a battery in the basement that basically would allow the house to not only store its own energy overnight, so that you're not using grid energy, coal-fired energy, stuff like that, but also you could begin to you know, be involved in like this new economy where you can sell credits back to the grid and whatnot. So it would allow folks to almost, you know, think about making money with renewable energy credits, which I think we should just increase the value of those tremendously, so folks can actually engage in a renewable energy economy and hopefully a sustainable way. Did you hear that, or was that all garbled?
No, your audio has been perfect since you turned your camera off. That might have been the secret to that. Awesome. Yeah, thinking about Rex in this future is an interesting one. And so we just got word Ms. Esther had to drop off, but she did actually have a question for the panel that I'll ask before we kind of move into our last round of questions. And I'll open this up to any of the three of you that want to answer. She is wondering how regular people will be able to get access to these green funds and new infrastructure funds, and ultimately these technologies. What is the average kind of Philadelphian living in a row home or living in a larger building do to access the things that we're talking about?
I would say that if the policy actually works, then they should open the door when it gets knocked to be offered their amazing new green retrofit. I mean, the last thing we need is some convoluted application process, especially for tenants, but also for low-income homeowners. The last thing we need is a crazy program that requires low-income homeowners to put additional debt onto their bills. New York State tried to come up with something called on-bill financing that would make it easy to do low-income retrofits. So Andrew Cuomo, right after the financial crisis, came up with a plan to retrofit 1 million homes in 5 years, mostly for low-income folks, by using on-bill financing. So the retrofit is just paid for by your utility bills. Out of 1 million planned retrofits, they achieved 25,000. That's neoliberalism in action. You try to debt finance on the back of poor families some green change, and you're not going to get any results except for a small number of unfortunate folks who are going to get potentially devastated by that program. So I think the other way to answer then Ms. Esther's question is, we got to organize. And if tenants organize and push and mobilize, then we will win political victories and get funds that are floating around the government sphere into proven technologies, proven techniques, and deliver results. So I don't know. I mean, it's an uphill battle, but this is by far the best time to be fighting it. And I'm pretty optimistic, actually, that we're going to get a lot of this stuff moving in the next few years.
Either Jeremy or Michelle?
Yeah, I was just going to say my answer also involves knocking on people's door. This is assuming that these programs are in place and we've gotten to the stage where you can get this stuff, you just have to know about it. Actually, right before this, I was in a workshop to get this free rain barrel from the city. You have to get on a wait list, then you have to get your registration, then you have to go to a workshop, you have to sit through this PowerPoint about the importance of public-private partnerships, then you have to fill out some more forms, and someone has to do consultation at your house, and then you have to pay part of it but they like to tell you how much they're paying. So really you're saving all this money. And I think that is just not what we would want to do in this situation. I think we can look at some of the vaccine efforts actually and kind of see how that worked. And you have to look at existing community networks, churches, like faith communities, schools, and those sorts of things.
Awesome. Jeremy, did you have anything to add, or should I move on to our last round here?
I think you can move on.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, that was actually a great segue, because the last round is about, like, how do we get these things? How do we organize? So Danielle, I'll go to you first. How do we build a movement for a Green New Deal for housing on the national level? And how do we tie together all of the struggles of racial justice, displacement, Green New Deal, climate justice, all of the things we've been talking about tonight?
Thank you so much, Sean. Yeah, I mean, for the first of all, just to pull out something you said, we have to make it very clear that a Green New Deal for housing is an anti-racist program. I mean, hard to come up with many things that have entrenched racism in the US as much as housing inequality. The median white family owns almost 10 times as much as the median Black family, and a massive amount of that can be chalked up to intergenerational transfer of housing wealth over the years, all coming out of the original New Deal's very racist redlining programs. So that's not the entire story of inequality in the United States. Racism isn't just housing, but it's a very big part of it. So we absolutely need to have a very strong, clear anti-racist policy. And that actually does mean, I think, within the housing community, something that we all know is that there can be some tension sometimes. We have to make sure that homeowning communities of color feel included, as well as tenants of color, working class tenants also feel included in this coalition. So I think we've actually had a really nice, rich conversation today about ways of retrofitting the homes of low-income homeowners of color who absolutely need to be protected. At the same time as I think with the national tenants movement, the big energy is around decommodifying housing, recognizing that at the end of the day, 100 years forward, if we've made a ton of progress, we will not live in a country with 100% home ownership, but that social progress probably looks like a country where housing is a human right and people don't need to own their home to have stability. Okay, so somewhat academic detour maybe, I don't know. But yeah, I think that, a big part of the organizing challenge is tenant movement, housing movement people spending time with climate movement people. I mean, a lot of organizing is just getting used to each other's priorities, ways of thinking. We're seeing that in some places. Something that's been really interesting, I don't know how widely known this is, the Sunrise Movement, which is like, the climate kids, mostly upper middle class white movement. In New York City, Sunrise Movement New York City said, we're gonna join the movement of the Green New Deal in the city. And that was the Green New Deal for public housing. So Sunrise Movement New York City, mostly, early 20s, white, relatively upper middle class kids, decided to throw down as their main campaign to organize in public housing and to do it in a way that was supportive of already existing campaigns within public housing for green retrofits and just for retrofits in general. So I think to those of you on this call and out in the world who are environmentalists, show up to the housing justice meetings, ask them what you can do and figure out a way to join their struggles. People fighting for housing are fighting like at an everyday level to prevent an eviction, which is a catastrophic emergency in a person's life. And although we live in a climate emergency, it is not literally tomorrow, right? So folks in the environmental movement who have the resources and have the time, show up to the housing movement meetings. And I think it is actually more incumbent on the environmentalists to figure out the housing struggles of their area than vice versa. Housing organizing is just some of the least well-resourced organizing in the world. Why? Because housing organizers are going up against real estate, which is the single most powerful lobby in the United States. So, if you're in the environmental movement and you have the privilege of class or of race, then use that, take the time, figure out how to plug into housing justice organizing. I think if we do that, then we will find there's a massive national tenants campaign, Homes Guarantee movement. There are housing movements that are thriving all across the country, and the environmental movement can very easily find points of intersection, ways to punch that stuff up even more. And I think if they do that, then we will find a much bigger movement, a more intersectional movement, and a movement that is very much connected with the kind of national political trends and even global political trends in terms of green investment. So I'm pretty optimistic. And I think more and more environmentalists are learning to see that they need to anchor themselves in struggles for racial and economic justice in communities. So hope more of that. And if we get it, I think, better days ahead.
I'm going to use everything Daniel just said to once again plug the rent control canvas. If you're here as a climate justice person, come to the rent control canvas this Saturday and in Saturdays later on. And I'm not just saying that because I'm someone who sits both in the Green New Deal world and the housing world, or maybe I am, who knows. So the next question I will toss to Jeremy. What role do architects and perhaps city planners or other professionals kind of in your world have in realizing the Green New Deal for housing, and where do architects that you know stand on the Green New Deal more generally?
Well, I think that we have a tremendous role in this, and we're kind of waking up to it fairly late in the game to realize that we're complicit in all of this. You know, I think we've stood on the mantle of design thinking and kind of like separated ourselves. And we were taught to do that, but now I think that there's been a big wake up call. You know, I've had my business for 10 years and I've tried to I've tried to find the intersections between housing and design and, you know, eradicating racism and fighting for environmental justice. But, you know, the market is not always the place to do that. We've had some success there. So we turn to affordable housing, and that's another institution that needs fixing. Right. And so I think that we have a responsibility to help craft policy and to help to share these resources with communities. So a couple of the positive ways in which we've been involved in doing that is there's something called the Passive Row House Manual that I can share in the link. I don't know if you know about this. It's a long manual. It's somewhat technical, but I think it's somewhat accessible as well and helpful for folks who want to learn how to do some retrofits to their house. And it's a lot of like open source stuff. The Passive House movement is very open source and it's really exciting. So there's lots of like information out there about how to do this for yourself or how to like help communities do this for themselves. Another way is that like we work with, you know, we've volunteered our time with a community design collaborative to help communities figure out how to do this. We've worked with other nonprofits to develop blueprints for how to deep energy retrofit their homes in Philadelphia and beyond. So there's ways that architects can give back and just really, I think a lot of it is changing the culture too. Like for instance, we work for some developers and I can just tell you that they all know how we feel, right? Like, I mean, I just want to put it out there. Like, I don't even think many of the developers in Philly, like, don't want to do something more interesting than what they are. I think they feel trapped by the economy in which they are. And I'm not having any compassion on them right now as much as to say, I think that they would be welcome, they would welcome more radicalized policy, many of them. I think you'd be surprised. In terms of architects, I think, I don't know any architects personally who wouldn't want, like, for instance, Passive House to be like building code, right? But I know most of them are not policy wonks fighting what's right? So I think that we need to get off the sidelines and get more involved with like how policy works and how to craft that beyond just building code, right? Like Philadelphia still has the most advanced energy code in the country for its basic building code, but it's really pathetically low compared to where it needs to be. And it doesn't address things like racial equity, right? I'm not sure the building code can, but like it needs to be better. And I think we need to keep fighting to make it better and to make things more efficient.
Thanks, Jeremy. And then this will be the last question and it will be for Michelle. And then after that, we can open it up to Q&A. And if you want me to ask your question, just type it out in the chat. If you want to ask your question, type stack in the chat and I will call on you. So last question for Michelle. How can we bring people together around this issue? What have you learned in your time as an organizer are some of the challenges to organizing and coalition building? And how can we?
Yeah, coalition building is easier said than done. And I think the value in it is that, you know, we have to have a really huge base of people. We have to have a really large group to fight these very powerful, you know, resources, these powerful entities. I think through the Rent Control Coalition, I've learned a lot about like how can groups who have like slightly different ideologies or places that they're coming from, like how can you set certain like beliefs or certain practices that are common among so that you can come together and like not agree on everything. It has to be okay to not agree on absolutely everything, but be able to build trust and to move together. I think the Rent Control Coalition, you know, in right before the pandemic hit, we were like ready to go. Kendra Brooks had announced that she was going to be holding this series of like community conversation town halls, and we were all like going to be at those, and then just the world shut down, and it's been tricky to figure out how to organize around that. But I think that year of us figuring out how to trust each other was actually extremely important. And I think it's especially important in Philly, especially for younger people or people who have moved here recently, to like respect the history of the movement in Philadelphia. You know, there were extremely radical like rent strikes here in the 60s, 70s, and to, you know, really be willing to meet with people and learn from them before you like completely charge ahead. And I think too, I want to go back to what Daniel said earlier about understanding the connection between these fights. I also, you know, there is a huge gun violence crisis in Philadelphia right now. That is top of mind for a lot of people. There, you know, there was a shooting on my corner this Friday. There's that on like up near Haverford Avenue, and that is also linked to housing. Like housing instability and poverty, like these are all connected. I think, you know, in some ways the challenge is not to get overwhelmed by how connected it all is. But I think, yeah, the fact that Sunrise has joined the coalition, the fact that we're seeing that, you know, I think housing, to me, housing, my perspective is that housing really connects to all issues in that way. And so that we have to seek out partners who like housing might not be like their only issue or their main issue, but it's connected to every community group in the city who's doing some kind of work. So I think being willing to have those conversations and, you know, reach out to people and kind of, you know, connect over this issue that we all share, and then figuring out, yeah, it sounds so vague to say figuring out how to work together, but it really is, you know, just requires really spending time and just talking to each other a lot, and figuring out ahead of time what you're going to do when there is conflict or if there is disagreement. That's, I think, really important.
Thanks so much for those wise words at the end there, Michelle. We have about 15 more minutes. If anyone has questions for any of our panelists, feel free to type stack in the chat and I will call on you. Or you can type your question in the chat.
Sean, I think Nicholas had a question in the chat. If
Oh yeah, oh sorry about that. Oh yeah, I kind of registered that in my head as a comment. Apologies. Does reducing embodied carbon have a place within the passive house model, or is the emphasis of the passive row house manual primarily concerned with reduction in energy use?
What an awesome question. Reducing embodied carbon is like what I like to talk about at Thanksgiving, and nobody wants to listen. So yeah, I mean, we embodied carbon, you know, is the sort of upfront carbon that's all sort of already in a home, or you can think of it as like if you're building a new home, it's the upfront carbon that it takes to, you know, in the materials that you're building with. And so we like to talk about the time value of carbon, right? You know, the time value of greenhouse gas emissions. And so they're more important. It's more important, in my opinion, given the crisis we're in, to focus on embodied carbon than operational carbon. Operational carbon is another word for, like, you know, low energy or zero energy, the carbon it takes to fuel a building or to electrify, the things like that, the energy we use for a building. So they're both very, very important, but that's why retrofits are great, because you have all this carbon locked into the building. And so focusing on we have a hyper focus on the materials we're putting inside of the building, and often low carbon materials are almost always also non-toxic, right? So there's sensible things like wood fiber insulation, dense packed cellulose insulation, which is made from recycled newspaper, things like that. We want to avoid things like spray foam, right? I think someone mentioned, Daniel mentioned gas. Can't believe we call it natural. I mean, it's basically methane. You want to keep gas out of buildings, but you also want to keep things like spray foam out of buildings, because the last thing you want to do is introduce bioaccumulative toxins into an airtight building and then hope that it's not going to hurt you, right? But this happens day in and day out, and it's a very difficult material to keep off of job sites, because it's a way that the fossil fuel industry has needled its way into the green building world, and it sort of has a sacrosanct position. So it even makes it into some of our jobs after we fight it away. And so something we have to keep talking about. So yes, embodied carbon is incredibly important.
Thanks, Jeremy. Did anyone else want to have any comments on that question, or can I move to the next one?
I would just say maybe that's an amazing answer, Jeremy. One of the sub themes here is that a lot of agricultural work can yield green building materials, things like industrial hemp, things like straw even. And so there's a potentially very exciting alliance between the regenerative agriculture world and the green building materials world. And if you think about a state like Pennsylvania, where we have these rural urban challenges, it's really exciting to start thinking that we could find a way to connect actually like agriculture justice, agriculture organizing, small family farms, regenerative agriculture in rural areas to the kind of green community investment in urban areas. And I'm very hopeful that a kind of like local green buildings emphasis could really help our politics reach outside of just the housing community, although it's a big one, but it could go even further.
Yeah, it's a good word, Daniel. There's folks in Pennsylvania growing hemp right now and making it into hempcrete. And it's just, it's wonderful. It's carbon sequestering, right? We can make housing that actually is made of carbon, right? It's sequestering air. It's sequestering carbon out of the upper atmosphere, and then it's a house. I think that stuff is just so beautiful. I'm glad you brought it up.
Awesome. Lynn, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I've really enjoyed the panel. You guys are amazing. My question is around either average cost for retrofitting a home, a row home, or pricing it out in such a way where, so I come out of the philanthropy world, and I guess one of my questions is kind of a model, maybe even, a workforce development model or a giving circle model where there are philanthropists who would pool their funding, pool their gifts or their philanthropy to fund the retrofitting. There are foundations that do this for community building and workforce development and some other things. I didn't know whether there was a model, maybe Daniel knows on a national level that this has been successful. But I think it comes down to, like, if you were gonna have funders fund houses or a block of houses, then it would have to be like, what would the cost per house be? What would that look like? And I don't know if that analysis is happening or will happen.
Thanks. I would just say quickly, I mean, Jeremy would know the better number for row houses, but in some recent work scoping out nationally, like a pretty decent quality green retrofit per home nationally, we're looking at about $30,000 a home. If you come into the Northeast and Philly, you'd probably be looking at something closer to 50 or 60. So I think there is definitely a role for philanthropy to fund pilot type projects, do a block, maybe do some of these cool district heating solutions. Put up 50, 100, 150 even per home so that you can be a little bit experimental and look for best practices. But the work at scale is going to be done with public funding. So I think that that is an interesting idea and worth thinking about. And I think you want to think in the neighborhood of 50 to 100 per home if you want to fund something cool and interesting. And I think I would want to see those things done with a view to pulling out best practices that could be scaled up with public funding. And you might want to look up the group Block Power as well, which is the most interesting group out there. I just typed it out, looking at electrification of homes and kind of public-private partnerships around that.
Yeah, I would second what Daniel said. I mean, at any of the numbers he just threw out for a typical row home, maybe we'll just call it like a 12 to 1,500 square row home, which is my house is on about 1,200 square feet. You know, if you have $30,000, can you get something done? Yes, but if you know, it really depends on. We work with a lot of different budgets from with like, you know, as a one-on-one private homeowner thing, but that is really like, you know, you're not taking money very far working in that kind of economy, right? Or you're just doing a one-off. What I'm really interested in is to scale up, like Daniel said, use funding in a way that's more visionary to do like a whole block or something like that, because you're going to get an economy of means, an economy of scaling up, where you're not just like fussing around with one house at a time. And once you scale up, you're really gonna see the savings go down. And that's just, you know, that's just with anything. I think we really need to see this as, how do we retrofit entire neighborhoods or an entire block or the entire city, things like that. But if you really just want to look at a one-off or a few at a time, fully getting to a zero energy, low carbon standard where you're fully gutting out the house and you have to move out to do it, you know, that's going to cost, you know, $150,000, right? And I don't know a lot of people that can afford that. That's the problem. And that's why I don't see it scaling up until we actually, as a country, take this seriously and say, if we don't do this, we won't solve the climate crisis. And therefore, here's your $150,000 plus move out and relocation costs, things like that. And, you know, just get it done. You know, the opposite of that is to say, don't move out and we're going to do it all on the outside. I'm more of a fan of that. And that technology is in the works, honestly, with projects like Realize out of Rocky Mountain Institute is hot on that. Just thinking about how do we don't want to displace all citizens in the country to retro. It's ridiculous. So how can we do it? Retrofit buildings mostly on the outside. Really fascinating stuff, like insulating on the outside, adding new mechanical systems to the outside of buildings on a pod. So you don't have to even put them down in the basement as sea levels rise and we see basements inundated with more and more water, things like that. So there's a lot of thinking around this, but the problem, I will leave it with this. The problem is not a technical problem, right? We have essentially solved these problems decades and decades ago, and we are improving on things like ERVs and solar panels. The problem is designing the funding, right? And opening that up. And I don't have an exact solution for that, but we haven't figured out how to finance these things at scale yet.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. So we'll do Mitch's question, and then if we have time, we'll do Kofi's question. So Mitch, how about you go first?
Uh-oh, I have like 5. I'm trying to consolidate them in my brain right now. Just wanted to say just real quick, if that's okay, that the Philadelphia Energy Authority is trying to pilot this built to last, like comprehensive home repair / electrification initiative. And I think they are trying to top off public funding with some private donations. And so then I could probably connect you with them if that's helpful. I have mixed feelings about it, but I definitely think it's a well-intentioned effort that might bear some fruit. I guess just oh my gosh, which of my questions? I am wondering about the potential job impacts. You know, I think if we're talking in Philly about retrofitting 400,000 row houses in a period of, I don't know how long, 20 years maximum, if we take the climate goals seriously, like, yeah, curious if Daniel or Jeremy or anyone has any thoughts about what would the impact be? What kind of employment would we be looking at? What would the economic impact be for people in Philly? Because I think among all the other reasons why it's critical to do everything that we've been talking about, we also have a huge crisis of unemployment and underemployment and poverty in Philly that requires many solutions, but you know, publicly funded home retrofits would be a way to at least make some progress in dealing with that. So.
My back of the envelope math tells me that's about 40,000 jobs a year. I'd have to go back and check it, but it'd be a lot of jobs. I mean, if you wanted to retrofit anything resembling 400,000 homes in the next 10 years, you're looking at like World War II type of mobilization. I mean, the entire federal government retrofits maybe 70,000 homes a year right now through the weatherization assistance program. So, you know, you will have as many jobs as you can possibly organize. This is probably how I put it.
Yeah, exactly what Daniel said. It's going to take a mobilization effort. I always like how people talk about it like it's World War II, because it's probably going to be even harder than that. But I think that we have, what's funny, and I don't know, I criticize America a lot, but I do think we actually have the kind of can-do attitude to get it done at the end of the day. And we definitely have the technology, and we have the spaces and resources and money. I just don't know if we have the political will or the understanding of how critical it is to focus on housing as one of the core centers of the climate crisis, right? But I do think it's possible. I do have optimism and hope, and I do think we can do it if we want to do it.
Thank you, Jeremy. Sean, is your internet on? Are you online now?
Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, sorry about that, everyone. I think we'll go to Kofi's question next.
Yeah, so I guess a lot of the talk today was about retrofitting houses, but I was just kind of wondering about thoughts about actually increasing housing stock, especially as we might possibly be taking like more climate refugees and things like that without screwing over current residents.
Not sure if Sean's online or not. I guess especially Daniel, you'd spoken about building a lot of new housing stock. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so I don't know if my internet cut off for a second. It was a question how to build new housing without displacing residents.
Yeah.
And especially, I think he gave some context around expecting a lot of climate refugees and you know, therefore the need for more housing stock.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are going to move. At an upper level estimate of sea level rise in the United States, something like 45 million people will live on land that floods once a year by the end of the century. So not very comfortable environment to live in. I mean, I think we need to build new non-market housing at scale. You know, and I said this, I guess, at the very beginning of this conversation, as we need to get used to the idea of millions of units every decade of new non-market housing, and that would not cause gentrification or displacement. I think at the same time, we need rent control to stabilize communities. Short of rent control, I really don't see any mechanism to prevent tenants from being displaced by landlords if they see their community's values going up from investment. So, you know, I think long-term, we have to get into a business that the United States has not been in for a very long time, which is to build substantial amounts of nonprofit housing. There are many different models. We could build housing and give it to community land trust. We could build limited equity co-ops. We could build project-based Section 8, privately managed, highly regulated, affordable housing. My preference probably would be public housing and community managed nonprofit housing. But I think there's just no question that we need to come up with a way to build new housing, and that's going to involve a big fight. Because what is the private housing sector? They're not worried that the public sector is going to build shitty housing. That is not what they're worried about. They're worried the public sector is going to build good housing and compete them out of the market. That's what happened in the New Deal. In the 1930s, there was a movement for modern housing in America. Good quality public housing was being built by the Public Works Administration of the New Deal. And the real estate industry got involved and said, absolutely no fucking way. And they lobbied and passed bills that said that public housing could only go to the lowest income Americans. And they capped the per unit cost that the federal government could put into new public housing to ensure that it wasn't built at a very high quality. So essentially the real estate industry sabotaged public housing in the 1930s deliberately to avoid having to compete with high quality social housing. So what we have to do now is fight back and win that fight against the real estate industry and to actually enable the public sector to build good high quality housing where they would commission the best architects around to build really good non-market housing cost effectively. We know how to do it. It's being done all over Europe. To some extent, it's being done in the US with tax credits, but there's no question the public sector can compete on really fabulous mixed income and low income housing. And the people trying to stop it are the real estate industry. We have the ability, the skills, the technologies, but we need the movement to push it through.
That sounds like a great place to end it. Apologies for my internet issues at the end there. I just put our sign-in link again in the chat. Thank you all so much for coming. And I do just want to quickly address, Agina had such a good comment at the end of the chat here. I think that there, as we've said so many times during this conversation, there's a bazillion different ways to like, this is all connected. Green New Deal and housing are truly connected to everything. So what about a part 2 later? Maybe we do a part 2 on connecting the private utility companies and our grid to this issue a little bit more. So I appreciate that, Agita. Thank you. And thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your evening. And I hope you stay engaged with one of the many organizations represented here tonight. So thank you, everyone.